Our chalice lighting words this morning are written by the Reverend Katie Romano Griffin. Come, let us enter into this space of hope and community. Come, let us enter into this space with our sorrows, our joys, our passion and compassion. Come, let us enter into this space with the stories of our ancestors, for their strength and wisdom beats in our hearts. Come into this space, present to the beloved companions who move beside us. Come into this space, mindful that together we are building a future for other generations. Come into this space and let us worship.
This morning, we also light our beautiful Advent wreath seated in our new candelabra, because it is the first Sunday of Advent, that period of waiting before Christmas in the Christian liturgical year. And our theological ancestors may have honored this time of year as a season of preparation. The first Sunday of Advent is often associated with hope. And so I share these words from the night church small group community I worship with. Hope is not wishful thinking, but the practice of moving toward the heart of God in ways that not only change us, but might even change the world. May it be so.
Good morning. Good morning. All right, you sound like a mighty crowd, although we are a small crowd gathered here this morning. Whoever you are and wherever you are from, and whether you've been here for many years or are visiting us for the first time, we are glad that you are here and you are welcome. Whatever your gender, whatever your age, whatever the color of your skin, whatever your background, you are welcome. Whether your heart is filled this morning with joy or with sorrow or fear or love or hope or anxiety or peace, you are welcome here. My name is Wendy Bell, and I'm currently serving as the interim senior minister here at First Parish of Bedford, and I'm delighted to be here with you and with Reverend Annie on this final Sunday of November. And as Annie mentioned, this is also the first Sunday of Advent. So as has been the tradition here, Mary and Joseph and the other travelers are here beginning their Advent journey to Bethlehem. Those of you who are here in the sanctuary can see them. Those of you who are not cannot yet, but hopefully will get a chance to as they make their way around to the front of the sanctuary by Christmas Eve. I have a few announcements to make this morning. First of all, there are no faith development classes this morning, but Coming of Age is meeting this afternoon at 6 p.m. Tuesday night, Reverend Annie is offering a simple sample small group ministry gathering. I don't know details of that, but Annie can tell us whether it's on Zoom or in person. And you can be in touch with Reverend Annie to get information about that if you'd like to. explore what a small group ministry experience feels like. The first Friday potluck gathering, I understand, will be this coming Friday, December 3rd at 6 p.m., I believe still on Zoom, but it's still a good way to gather and get to see people and chat if you haven't had a chance to see people in chat recently and would like to. Next Saturday at 2 p.m., the Back Bay Ringers are having their concert here in the sanctuary, I believe, so please come to that. Tickets, I think, have been sold, but if you have tickets, come, and I believe it will also be on Zoom. Next Saturday also at 5 p.m. on the Common will be the town tree lighting, and I understand that members of our junior and senior youth groups have volunteered to serve hot chocolate that afternoon, and so I hope you'll come for the tree lighting outside and also to support them in that volunteer work, which is a great offering to the community. And finally, next Sunday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon on Zoom will be the monthly Lyceum, and the presenter next week will be Brad Connor, our own music director here at First Parish, offering a presentation on the bells of Christmas. And those are the announcements that I have for this week. And now, whether you are here in the sanctuary or at home on Zoom, I'd like to invite you to rise in body or in spirit so that we can say together the words of our unison affirmation, first in English and then in Spanish. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. El amor es el espíritu de esta iglesia, y el servicio es su ley. Este es nuestro gran pacto, vivir juntos en paz, buscar la verdad en el amor, y ayudarnos los unos a los otros.
Our reading this morning comes from a 2016 podcast episode from the podcast Invisibilia about personality. Consider the story of Delia Cohen. Like most of us, she believed in a core consistency in humans. She'd seen it in people her whole life. The good people were good, the bad, bad. Cohen had been doing some work for the TED organization, the one that does TED Talks, and she had heard about a TEDx event that was put on in a prison by prisoners. So she went to Marion Correctional Institution in Marion, Ohio, to see it. One of the prisoners she met was a man named Dan. He had the word hatred tattooed on the back of his neck. But as soon as she started talking to Dan, Cohen completely forgot about the tattoo. His personality didn't seem to have anything to do with hatred. The prisoner's presentation included poetry and music. Cohen liked it so much that she told Dan she wanted to work with him to recreate it in prisons across the country. Then a friend of hers Googled Dan and started reading descriptions of his crime to Delia. Cohen says, "I was absolutely horrified." She went home and tried to figure out how she should think about Dan. Was he the kind, creative, competent person she had met, or the brutal, sadistic personality who had committed the crime? We decided to ask Dan ourselves. When he committed the crime, Dan says, "I was a real piece of shit." But he says that person has ceased to exist. It happened 6 or 7 years into prison, Dan says. His best friend in prison had stolen something from another inmate, and Dan, who had a reputation for being violent, told the other inmate to back off. Then he went back to his best friend and beat him up. Dan remembers looking down at the man he was beating and thinking, "Whoa, what am I doing? This is someone I say I love." This is someone I care about. This is someone I say that I treat like family. And this is how you treat family? Dan says that's the last time he was physically violent. He decided to quit the group of guys he hung out with in prison. He physically isolated himself. It was hard. His quote, "It was easier to be a no-good mother effer than it was to be alone." Dan says it took him about 2 years to reconfigure his personality. He wanted to be less aggressive, less impulsive, more conscientious. He says he's now a different person, but he knows most people won't see him that way. Delia Cohen had a hard time accepting that Dan had changed. You hear these words so often from people, and they're often not true. But she decided to suspend her disbelief and work on the TEDx project. They started exchanging emails. Cohen knew that there are people whose horrible crimes really do emanate from a fixed trait, like a psychopath, but after more than a year of working with Dan, Cohen felt sure that that wasn't him. She's still working with prisoners on the TEDx project, and she says she no longer even thinks about their crimes. I'm more curious about who they are now. Even though Dan says he's no longer the man who committed the crime, he knows why he's in prison. I have to atone for my crime, but I realize now I'm just paying someone else's debt. The person who committed the crime no longer exists.
Well, on Thursday, many of us were, I hope, able to spend some time with a few loved ones and share some food and conversation and hopefully some laughter. And hopefully most of us were able to find ample reasons to feel gratitude in this season of harvest, this time of abundance, when we enjoy the fruits of the year past and prepare for a cold season ahead. One of the things for which I am grateful, particularly in this difficult season in the world, is First Parish in Bedford, for the ways that you continue to care for one another, even during this pandemic time, and for the community around you. And we could not continue to do that work, to provide these services, to provide the music that you enjoy each Sunday, without your commitment and your financial support. And so this morning, in the spirit of gratitude, in the spirit of hope, in the spirit of love and justice and abundance, I invite you to take up a morning offering to support the work of this church and the continuing work of this church in the larger world.
I'm not sure when it happened, but at some point in the last 5 years or so, I stopped liking Kraft macaroni and cheese. And this was very shocking because growing up, I loved Kraft macaroni and cheese. It was my favorite comfort food. And not just when I was a little kid. This lasted well into my 20s. I was not much of a cook, and I liked things that were convenient, and that really fit the bill. I prepared macaroni and cheese so often in graduate school that when I first met my former spouse and co-parent, Lucas, he took me to a fancy macaroni and cheese shop on our first date because he knew how much I loved macaroni and cheese. So imagine my surprise when one day I realized not only did I not really want to eat Kraft macaroni and cheese, I just couldn't even bring myself to have a bite. It tasted so chemically and squishy and very unappealing. This was an unfortunate side effect of a project that I had embarked on in my mid-20s of becoming a person who liked more foods. I grew up an incredibly picky eater in the middle of the Midwest where we ate a lot of bland carbs, you know what I mean? A lot of like meatloaf, potatoes, macaroni and cheese. And so when I went away to a boarding school in New Mexico, where the cooks in the dining hall were from New Mexico and made local cuisine, I basically ate peanut butter and jelly for my first year there because I didn't like any of the food. And slowly I had to train myself to like foods that were not just bland carbs. And over time, I began to acquire more and more foods, and it became sort of a project where I always was trying to work on something. So maybe first I'd work on, asparagus, and then I'd work on artichokes, and then I'd work on, my latest acquisition is beets. I have now become a person who likes beets. I can say it with confidence. And I think my next challenge will be olives. I'll let you know how it goes. So when I was home for Thanksgiving, just this past week, which was wonderful, my mom, as she was talking about the menu, she said, and you don't like mushrooms, right? And I said, no, I've liked mushrooms for years now. But how could she keep track? The tastes have been changing so rapidly and acquiring so many new things over time. And we all change all the time, right? I bet many of us can recall versions of ourselves from the past who would be bewildered, maybe a little horrified by some of who we are now, and versions of ourselves from the past who would be amazed and astonished at who we've become. And that can be disorienting because on the one hand, we all know that we all change, and on the other hand, we do have a cultural belief that personality is somewhat stable. There's many pieces of advice that float around saying, if someone shows you who they are, believe them. And the famous, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And these pieces of advice exist for good reason. Sometimes our desire to believe the best in people causes us to be taken advantage of repeatedly, and that's not a helpful thing. And at the same time, we know sometimes people really do change. And I think that it's common for us to love to hear those stories. Stories like the one that Invisibilia highlighted about Dan, the man who went from being violent and harmful to being caring and conscientious and spreading art. We so want to believe that is possible, and for me, it's one of the pieces of my theology that forms a basis for my commitment to transformative justice, among other things, that belief that we can all be transformed. But at the same time, it can be confusing. Confusing how to relate to people who have changed, who say they've changed, and confusing how to relate to our former selves. Sometimes we want to distance. At least I know I do that sometimes. I remember particularly when I went away to undergrad and I started learning more about systemic inequality and the way that racism was built into our institutions and our country. And the more I learned, the more I felt ashamed and confused and angry about some of the beliefs I had held growing up, more naive beliefs about how things were fair or getting better. And so I started to distance myself from that more hopeful mindset that I had held when I was younger, from the sort of naive white girl from Normal, Illinois who wanted to help people and save the world. And I became cynical and self-righteous and judgmental because I didn't want to be her anymore. We do that sometimes. But other times we want to hold on to some former self we're not ready to let go of. It took me a really long time to admit to myself that I was no longer a reader. Because growing up being a reader was a big part of my identity, and I loved reading novels. It was one of my favorite ways to escape and to find pleasure. You could always turn to a book, a good constant companion. And plus, it was part of how I connected with my mother, also a reader, and part of my identity as a smart kid and a kid who was good in school. And so it took a long time for me to admit to myself, I just don't read anymore. I don't do it. It's hard to bring myself to open a book, and I don't finish them most of the time. I wanted to hang on to that story of myself. And I think that is a really common trait in us humans. The thought to ponder I put on the order of service comes from a source of wisdom that I particularly am fond of. You've maybe heard me mention it before, the Enneagram, which is a personality system that I find useful. But the wisdom can be applied whether or not you're at all interested in this 9-person personality system. It says that you can pour your energy into maintaining the structure of your personality or liberate it for change and growth. And whether we're distancing or clinging, it's really a similar thing of putting the energy towards maintaining a story of who we are rather than being who we are and being open to that transformation. And that's a wonderful thought, and it's an easy thing to say or put on an order of service, but much trickier to apply, I've found, at least in my life. One framework that I've found very useful in thinking about relating to past selves and moving out of that space of distancing or clinging is the framework of internal family systems, something that I came across in therapy. IFS is the acronym, Internal Family Systems. And the idea is that you can think about your internal emotional landscape like a family, a bunch of different characters all relating to each other with all the complicated relationships that one finds in a family system. Many of us may be feeling intimately familiar with our family systems at this time of the holidays. But this is about the family in us. And many of us carry within us different patterns of behavior that we acquired or learned at different stages of our life in the past when we were younger. Patterns that maybe served us well at some point and maybe don't serve us quite as well now. And the way that you work with these parts in this therapeutic method is that you get curious about them, which can be very hard to do if you're angry at yourself for being in that habit that you don't like to be in. But what you're urged to do is befriend these parts and get curious and have a little conversation and Ask, what are you about? And what are you afraid of? And what are you protecting me from with this habit, with this pattern? It's about tending to the people within our own internal landscapes. And I think part of why this is so hard is because we have to face very difficult emotional realities, usually through this work, usually behind some habit that we wish we could leave behind or that's tripping us up. Usually behind that habit is some painful feeling that we're protecting ourselves from, some painful memory or event. And so it's very difficult to do this work. Another reason it can be difficult is because sometimes it's very hard for us to extend compassion to ourselves, to parts of ourselves from the past, to ourselves from what we may have done before. And I was listening to another podcast. You can tell I'm not a reader anymore, but I am a podcast listener. I was listening to another podcast, Hidden Brain, which I also enjoy, that was talking about the joys and challenges of self-compassion. And they were speaking with a psychologist, Dr. Kristen Neff, who has done many studies about the value of self-compassion. And she was talking about her own journey with forgiving herself and how she had an extramarital affair when she was younger. And for many years, she could not forgive herself for this. And she would just sort of berate herself and feel, oh, I was so stupid, and how could I do this thing? And eventually she realized that while she told herself she didn't want to sort of let herself off the hook for this bad behavior, a lot of it was about not wanting to look and face and really deal with what had happened and who she was. That harshness with ourselves is often a way of doing that distancing, right? That I'm not that person. I'm really mad at that person. I'm not that person. And so it's this funny thing where sometimes we tell ourselves, oh, well, I can't be compassionate with that part of myself because it's too awful. But really, it's refusing the compassion that allows us to feel separate. And that when we offer compassion to our past self, it better allows us to take accountability for our actions. And studies have apparently borne this out, that people who offer themselves compassion are better at taking accountability, admitting when they're wrong, apologizing well, and taking actions to repair harm. So what a paradox. That in order to better take accountability for ourself of the past, we have to forgive ourself of the past. It's a complicated thing to do. Kristen Neff offers some practices that I think are very useful practices, really for anything. There are 3 practices. One is self-compassion over self-judgment, that offering care instead of offering a sort of distancing condemnation. The second one is common humanity over isolation. This one I really like. It's helpful to me. Remembering when we're feeling like we've done something so bad or we're so upset with some part of ourselves that we're not that special. Everybody screws up. And then the last one, mindfulness versus over-identification. Being aware and noticing without being caught up in whatever that feeling is, with that negative story. And I find that to be very challenging myself, being with rather than being in the story. But I also find that when I can do it, it is incredibly liberating. The energy that we can save, when we're not pouring it into maintaining the structure of our personality and ego, we can use that energy for so many other things. And so I try to use these practices when I'm getting stuck. Remind myself that paradoxically, it is the compassion that allows for more accountability. It is the humility that allows for stopping from beating ourselves up, and it is the being in our own experience, being in our own bodies, that releases us from these stories of who we are and who we used to be and who we should be, allows us to become who we are becoming. We are going through very big changes these days. We keep naming it, and it keeps being true. Big changes in our culture, in our country, and in this church. And we're in that time of the year when a lot of traditions come out. We get out the nativity characters and the Advent wreath. And many of us may find ourselves encountering traditions from the past, longing to recreate traditions from the past, or finding that we want to distance ourselves from some past set of holiday traditions. And so I think this is an especially good time to practice these spiritual practices, as past selves may be popping up all over the place within us as we move through this time, and as we are called to become braver people, more compassionate people by the circumstances we're in, that maybe we can hold a little space for all those selves within ourselves, all those past versions of us that live inside us. Hold some compassionate space for them without judgment, knowing that we are all so human, all in this together, noticing without needing to change the story of who we are. And maybe we can offer some of that here too, to one another as we move through this time. A little more compassion, a little more common humanity, a little more mindfulness as we move through it all.
Good morning. Morning. Pulse. Pulse is a huge part of the way that we experience our humanity. We feel the pulse of our hearts. We feel the pulse of our gait when we walk. We feel the pulse of our breathing in and out. And when we feel that pulse together, there's an amazing sense of connection to be had. And so we offer this movement prayer in that spirit, in particular so that we can feel the pulse of our breath and our movement together. A quick word about what the prod means and that's produced. The recording was made, my son Emery helped me to make the recording and also did a lot of the video, the arranging of the sound. I don't know exactly, I guess they call it producing.
Well, this movement prayer is a way to be together. It has been so hard being apart during the pandemic, and it continues to be so hard to be apart. You know, moving is a way to be together in community. I know it's really been a saving grace for me, being able to continue to move. This movement prayer begins with breathing, and we did it back a few weeks ago, you might recall. It's one that may become familiar to us. But we begin with breathing. And, you know, we breathe. You're welcome to close your eyes. You know, breathing, connecting inwards to begin with as a way to find stillness, as a way to connect like with all the parts, with all that you are, connecting, slowing down. And then you're welcome to continue to breathe through the movement prayer You're also welcome to join in with us and follow along with a series of really easy to follow movement gestures that repeat. And there's no right or wrong way to do these movement gestures. You can make it uniquely your own. You can do this little series seated, you can do it standing, and please do it with us along in your own living room, from your own space at home on Zoom. We are a community. Moving together is a way to connect with each other. Let's be together. Let's move together.
There's something that I can't explain, but I can feel it just the same. Sometimes when I sit with you, it feels like 1 + 1 makes more than 2. The energy of life swirls round. I feel my feet upon the ground. This thoughtful presence that we share, it makes the hard times easier to bear. There's something that I can't explain, but I can feel it just the same. Sometimes when I stand with you, it feels like 1 + 1 makes more than 2. The energy of joy swirls round. I feel my hands upon the ground. This vibrant presence that we share, it makes the chaos easier to bear. There's something that I can't explain, but I can feel it just the same. Sometimes when I sway with you, it feels like 1 + 1 makes more than 2. The energy of grief swirls round. I feel my knees upon the ground. This caring presence that we share, it makes the sadness easier to bear. There's something that I can't explain, but I can feel it just the same. Sometimes when I breathe with you, it feels like 1 + 1 makes more than 2. The energy of love swirls round. I feel my heart upon the ground. This soulful presence that we share, it makes the distance easier to bear.
Thank you so much to our movement prayer practitioners and to everyone who made that recording possible. It's one thing to talk about being present to ourselves with compassion, but it's quite a lot better to do it. So I'm grateful for that space and that time. May we find moments like that this Advent season and whenever else we need them. Moments to be in our bodies, be with our many selves. Find that connection, that energy where whatever number of people are present, it's more, it's more, it's more. May we find that here together on our own and wherever we need it.